All right, so today we're going deep on Joseph Stalin, but with a bit of a twist. We're using the Enneagram as like a lens to look at his life, trying to see if his actions make more sense. When we think about him as a self-preservation type 8, and, right off the bat, I just want to say this is not about saying what he did was okay. Obviously, his regime, caused unimaginable suffering. We're just trying to see if this system, the Enneagram, can help us understand his motivations.
Yeah, totally agree. This isn't about justifying or excusing anything. It's more like, Imagine we found some new historical document that gives us a totally new way to understand Stalin's thinking, the Enneagram with its 9 personality types. It gives us a framework to understand how people see the world, how their fears and desires drive their actions.
Okay, so for those of us who aren't, Enneagram experts, what makes a type 8 different?
Well, 8s are driven by this need for power and control. It's about asserting themselves,
Yeah.
not letting anyone else control them. But with the self-preservation 8, it's all about survival. They're always thinking 10 steps ahead, calculating every move to make sure they're safe and secure. They build these fortresses to protect themselves. And I mean that both literally and metaphorically.
Ah, interesting. And when you say fortresses, I immediately picture Stalin in the Kremlin. His seat of power. I mean, the guy was obsessed with security. Layers upon layers of guards, secret police everywhere. You couldn't get near the place.
Yeah, great example. The Kremlin during Stalin's time, it was like this physical representation of his inner world, this fortress mentality and that need to control. It went way beyond his personal safety. It influenced everything about his regime.
Right.
Think about the policies. Forced collectivization. Rapid industrialization. I mean, it wasn't just about communist ideology, although that was obviously a part of it. He wanted to control the lifeblood of the Soviet Union, the resources, the production, the people.
So, if you look at it through this lens,
Right.
it makes his actions seem kind of not logical. I mean, obviously still chilling. But if you truly believe the world is out to get you and you have the power to change everything, why wouldn't you go to those lengths?
That's the unsettling part, right? But we can't forget the human cost of that kind of thinking, this need for control, especially for a self-preservation 8. It can manifest in really destructive ways, and we see that all over Stalin's reign.
Yeah, for sure. Let's actually get into some specifics on that, because
Right.
that's where this gets really interesting. We talked about 3 main areas where this need for control took over. Control over territory, eliminating threats, and that ruthless focus on survival at all costs.
Right, those are good starting points. Let's start with territorial control. Stalin was fixated on expanding Soviet influence. He saw it as essential for his own security and for the Soviet Union's survival. After World War II, he set up this buffer zone of satellite states in Eastern Europe. It wasn't just about spreading communism. It was about having a protective barrier, almost like a modern-day Roman limes,
Yeah.
a defensive line against potential enemies.
He was like, if I control enough land, no one can touch me.
Exactly, and we see the same thing in his domestic policies. Take collectivization, for example. On paper, it was about aligning agriculture with socialist principles, but underneath, it was about controlling the food supply, making sure the regime could survive famines.
Right, I see.
Control over land meant control over resources, which meant survival.
Okay, so territorial control equals survival in Stalin's mind. But then there's this darker side, this need to eliminate any threat. I don't think we need to remind anyone about the purges. Millions imprisoned, executed, disappeared, all under Stalin's reign of terror.
Yeah, and that's where the intolerance for frustration comes in. Self-preservation 8s have such a low threshold for anything that feels like a challenge to their control. For Stalin, that meant getting rid of any opposition, no matter how small, even if it meant horrifying violence.
I think most people understand that the purges were about getting rid of rivals. But was he really that paranoid?
He wasn't just reacting to actual threats. He was eliminating anyone who could be a threat later.
Wow.
He controlled information, rewrote history, created this environment where even a whisper against him could get you sent to the gulag. A truly terrifying example of what happens when this personality type has absolute power.
It's like he was playing 4D chess
Yeah.
while everyone else was playing checkers.
You got it. And his opponents, the ones who underestimated him, they paid the price. And it wasn't just political, it was personal. Stalin held grudges, and he was patient. He'd wait years to get his revenge.
Like Trotsky. Right. Instrumental in the Bolshevik Revolution with Lenin, and Stalin still had him assassinated years later in Mexico.
Exactly. It's like something out of Shakespeare.
Yeah.
And it shows that vengeful instinct that's so strong in 8s, especially the self-preservation subtype. Their revenge is calculated, thought out, It simmers for years before boiling over.
I mean, it makes you wonder, did he enjoy it? This slow elimination of anyone who questioned him.
That's a dark thought. It's hard to know what was going on in his head. But what we can say is, his actions created this atmosphere of fear and paranoia that affected every single level of Soviet society. No one was safe, not even his closest allies.
Okay, so we've got the control over territory
Mhm.
and this elimination of any potential threat. But what about this third part, this relentless focus on survival? Where does that fit in?
Well, remember, for the self-preservation eight, survival is the only why goal, and control is how they get there. Stalin saw the world as this incredibly dangerous place, and every decision he made, no matter how brutal or contradictory, was about making sure his regime survived.
I mean, we see that playing out in some pretty shocking ways.
Definitely. Think about the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. Stalin knew he wasn't ready for a war with Germany in '39, so he makes a pact with Hitler, his ideological enemy, to buy himself some time. He basically said, screw morals. He even divided up Poland with the Nazis, all to survive.
It's like pragmatism above all else. Even communist ideology took a backseat.
Exactly. And it's that pragmatism, combined with that deep need for control, that shaped not just his decisions, but the very structure of Soviet society. He turned the country into a machine, and he was the engineer, all in the name of survival.
Wow. It's like his personality became part of the Kremlin itself and spread outward.
That's a great way to put it. And, it wasn't just about policies and strategies. This need to control also affected his personal relationships.
Oh, yeah. And by relationships, we're talking about the lack of them.
Right. For self-preservation eight, relationships are transactions. It's about what the other person can do for them, how they contribute to their security and control.
And Stalin was famous for using people
Yeah.
and then just tossing them aside when they weren't useful anymore.
Exactly. Look at Trotsky, Bukharin. Once close allies, then they became liabilities. He had no problem eliminating anyone, even people he was close to, if they threatened his control.
Wow. I can't imagine being that emotionally detached.
Right.
And in his personal life, his wife's suicide, the strained relationships with his kids, it's like he just couldn't be emotionally vulnerable.
But that's the thing about the self-preservation eight's armor. It's so thick, so impenetrable, that they end up isolated, even from the people closest to them.
So they're alone in their fortress,
Yeah.
surrounded by enemies, real and imagined.
Exactly. And that isolation, that constant vigilance, it takes a toll, mentally and emotionally.
Which maybe explains why, as Stalin got older, he withdrew from public life even more.
Right. More reclusive, more reliant on his inner circle, decisions became more centralized, more driven by his whims and suspicions.
It's like that classic story, the leader who wants to protect the people ends up isolating himself from them and losing touch with reality.
It's a tragic irony. We see it again and again in history, this search for absolute security, leading to a kind of psychological prison.
And for Stalin, that prison wasn't just metaphorical. He was holed up in the Kremlin, surrounded by guards and yes-men.
Right.
His world getting smaller every year.
And it's in that environment, that echo chamber he created, that his worst impulses were allowed to grow. Paranoia deepening, grip on power tightening, and the consequences for anyone who crossed him, even more severe.
Yeah, it's scary to think about. We've talked about the need for control, the paranoia. But there's another piece of the self-preservation eight that we haven't really gotten into yet. Their vengeful nature.
Oh, yeah. Revenge is a powerful motivator for all eights. But especially for this subtype, it's not about getting mad and lashing out. It's about carefully planned, deliberate payback.
We saw hints of that earlier, like how we treated Trotsky.
Oh.
But did that vengeful side get even worse later on?
Definitely. As Stalin's grip on power loosened and his health started to decline, he became obsessed with punishing anyone who had wronged him, real or imagined.
Like, do you have a specific example?
Well, think about Nikolai Yezhov, head of the NKVD, the secret police. During the worst of the purges, Yezhov was brutal, responsible for countless deaths. But in 1938, Stalin decided he wasn't useful anymore. He even saw him as a potential threat.
Oh, wow. So Yezhov became a victim of the purges himself.
Exactly. Arrested, tortured, executed. It shows that even the people closest to Stalin, the ones who did his dirty work, they weren't safe from his wrath.
Like a snake eating its own tail. This system meant to eliminate threats ends up turning on itself.
Right, and it shows how unstable a system built on fear and paranoia is. No one is truly safe, not even the ones in charge.
It's a lot to think about. It makes me wonder, is this self-destructive cycle inevitable for a self-preservation eight? Are they doomed to become victims of their own need for control?
That's a great question, and one we'll keep exploring as we go into the last part of our deep dive. We'll look at the impact of Stalin's personality on Soviet society, and think about whether this type, the self-preservation ape, might actually create the conditions for their own downfall.
Yeah, can't wait to get into that. See you in part 2.
Welcome back. So as we get into these later years of Stalin's rule, we start to see these cracks in his fortress. His paranoia that was always there under the surface, it starts to take over.
It's almost like the system he built to control everything ends up turning on him. Is that common with this type, this turning inward of anxieties?
It can be the self-preservation ape. They want to get rid of all threats, but that can make them a prisoner of their own system. Their world gets smaller. They trust fewer and fewer people. And eventually, everyone becomes a suspect.
And with Stalin's power, that paranoia had some really awful consequences.
Absolutely. One of the most chilling examples is the doctor's plot from the early 50s. Basically, Stalin became convinced that a group of doctors, many of them Jewish, were planning to assassinate him and other leaders.
Wait, hold on. Was there actually any evidence for this?
Not really. It was mostly based on fake confessions, forced out of people through torture and intimidation. The whole thing was made up, driven by Stalin's paranoia and maybe also his own anti-Semitism.
So we're talking about a full-blown conspiracy theory, created by a dictator with the power to make it real.
Exactly. The doctor's plot led to mass arrests, show trials, even executions. It created this atmosphere of fear and suspicion, especially for Soviet Jews, who were seen as potential enemies of the state.
It's like a reminder of how dangerous paranoia can be,
Yeah.
especially when it's mixed with that much power.
It's like a virus. It spreads out and infects everything.
And it wasn't just the direct victims of Stalin's paranoia. This kind of environment, where everyone's a possible enemy, it destroys trust, relationships.
Absolutely.
It leaves scars on a whole society.
You're right. We talked earlier about how Stalin's relationships were mostly transactional.
Right.
But can you even have real connections when you're that distrustful of everyone?
That's a good question.
It's definitely a challenge. The self-preservation ape's need for control often means they can't let go, can't be vulnerable with other people. They see vulnerability as weakness, like an invitation to be taken advantage of.
So they end up alone in their fortress.
Surrounded by enemies, real and imagined.
Right, and all that vigilance.
It wears you down, mentally and emotionally.
Which maybe explains why. As Stalin got older, he seemed to withdraw even more.
Yeah, exactly. He became more reclusive, more dependent on his inner circle. Decisions were made by him based on his suspicions.
It's that classic pattern again. The leader wants to protect the people,
Yeah.
but ends up isolating himself from them, losing touch with reality.
Tragic, but we've seen it so many times. The search for total security turns into a prison.
Yeah, for Stalin, it wasn't just metaphorical. He was literally stuck in the Kremlin. Guards, yes men,
Yeah.
his world shrinking around him.
And in that kind of environment, that echo chamber, his worst instincts got even worse. His paranoia, his need for control, the consequences for crossing him became even more severe.
It's a scary thought.
Yeah.
And, we've talked about control, the paranoia.
Yeah.
But there's that other side of the self-preservation aid, the vengeful side.
Right. Revenge is a powerful force for all eights, but especially for this subtype. It's not about anger, it's about strategy. Carefully planned retribution.
We saw some of that before with Trotsky. But did it get worse as Stalin got older?
Definitely. As he lost his grip on power, as his health declined, he became fixated on punishing anyone who had wronged him, even if they hadn't actually done anything.
Do you have an example?
Think about Nikolai Yezhov, head of the NKVD, the secret police. During the height of the purges, Yezhov was ruthless, responsible for so many deaths. But in 1938, Stalin decided he was a liability, a potential threat.
Wow. So even Yezhov ended up a victim of the purges.
Exactly. He was arrested, tortured, executed. It shows that no one was safe from Stalin, not even the people who carried out his orders.
It's like that snake eating its own tail again. The system meant to get rid of threats turns on itself.
It shows you how unstable that kind of system is, a system based on fear and paranoia. No one is truly safe, not even the ones at the top.
It makes you think, is that self-destruction built into the self-preservation aid?
It's a great question, and one we'll keep thinking about. As we move into the final part of our deep dive, we'll look at what Stalin left behind, how his personality shaped Soviet society, and whether this type, the self-preservation aid, might actually create the conditions for their own downfall.
Okay, so we've been looking at Stalin through this lens of the self-preservation type 8. And it was pretty clear that his need for control, the paranoia, even his vengeful side, it shaped everything. Not just what HE did, but the whole course of Soviet history. But now that we're at the end of our deep dive, I'm thinking about his legacy. How do we even begin to understand the impact of someone so complex and contradictory?
It's a question historians are still debating. I mean, Stalin's rule was brutal. Repression, famine, war. But it was also a time of rapid industrialization,
Hmm.
modernization. He turned the Soviet Union into a global superpower.
Yeah, there's this weird duality to him. The tyrant, who is also a modernizer. It makes it even harder to separate the man from the myth, the propaganda.
Absolutely. He created this cult of personality. And even now, there are people who see him as this strong leader who saved Russia from fascism, who made them a global power. But we can't forget the millions who died, the families torn apart, the fear that was everywhere in Soviet society for decades.
So how do we make sense of these two sides of him?
I think we have to remember that history is complicated. It's rarely black and white. Stalin was a product of his time, a ruthless pragmatist who believed that any means were justified to get what he wanted. And in the beginning, maybe he really did want to improve life for the Soviet people, but somewhere along the line, power corrupted him. It twisted his vision and led to unimaginable cruelty.
It makes you think. Was it inevitable, given his personality? Did his need to survive, to control everything, ultimately lead to his own downfall?
That's a fascinating question. By the time he died in '53, Stalin had become so isolated, paranoid, out of touch with reality. His inner circle was terrified of him. The whole country was basically held hostage by his moods, his whims, in a way, his need for control. Created a system that couldn't survive, vulnerable to the very things he was trying to control.
He built this elaborate fortress
Yeah,
and ended up trapped inside.
exactly. And even his death is a mystery. Some say natural causes, others think something more sinister. But whatever happened, his death marked a new era for the Soviet Union. A time of cautious reform trying to move away from Stalinism.
But even after he was gone, Stalin's shadow hung over the country.
Oh, absolutely. His legacy was too big, too woven into the fabric of Soviet society to just disappear. And you could argue that Russia is still dealing with the consequences today.
Right, I'm thinking about the political climate now, this rise of authoritarianism, the war in Ukraine. Are these echoes of Stalin?
I think it's safe to say his ghost is still haunting Russia. That cult of personality, crushing any dissent, propaganda, disinformation, these are all tactics straight out of Stalin's playbook, and they're being used again now.
Wow. It's a reminder that history isn't just something we read about. It shapes everything.
Exactly. And that's one of the big takeaways here from this look at Stalin. By understanding the past, the motivations of leaders like him, we can get a better grasp on the present, and maybe even see the dangers ahead.
So what can our listener take away from all this? This look at Stalin through the self-preservation type 8.
It shows the dangers of unchecked power, how fear and paranoia can destroy, and how important it is to protect individual rights and freedoms. It also reminds us that anyone can be corrupted by power, especially if their personality makes them vulnerable to it.
And it really emphasizes the power of personality, how one person's inner world can change the course of history.
Absolutely. And on a personal level, it makes you think about yourself, your motivations, your tendencies, and how your personality might be influencing your actions, your relationships.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I'm left with this mix of fascination and unease. Fascinated by how complex Stalin was, but uneasy knowing that this potential for tyranny, for abusing power, it exists in all of us.
That's a powerful thought, right? The line between good and evil, self-preservation and self-destruction, it can be so thin. And in the end, it's up to each of us to decide where we stand.